The stories that I tell are stories that were told to me many years ago by my grandfather, who was born on an island off the coast of Tennant's Harbor, Maine, in Knox County. At about the age of 12, he went to sea and as a cabin boy, and moved his way up until he became a sea captain, retired at about the age of 58, so that when I knew him as a kid, he was retired. And I would go down to his house in Tennant's Harbor. He had an old sea captain's house, because that's what he was. And we would sit there in his den, and he would tell me stories. And I used to say to him things like, "Grandpa, if you hadn't gone away to sea, what would you have done?" And he said, "Well, you know, I always wanted to be a Maine hunting guide." And I said, "Well, why didn't you become one?" He said, "Well, because I had never even held a gun." And of course, you can't be a hunting guide unless you know all there is to know, not only about hunting, but about sports and guns. He said, "But one year I was home, I had a lot of time off, and I asked around to local sportsmen, and one of them said, you want to be a Maine guide? You come over to my house tomorrow morning, I will teach you everything there is to know about guns." Well, the next morning, bright and early, my grandfather got up, he went over, knocked on the door, a fella comes out, he's still in his pajamas. My grandfather was furious. He said, "I thought we was going hunting." He said, "Don't keep your shirt on, just be quiet, I'll be right back." He went in the kitchen. 2 minutes later, he comes out again. In one hand, he's holding a rusted-out old squirrel gun. In the other hand, he's holding 2 shells. He gives my grandfather the gun, he gives him the shells, and he said, "Now, do you see those tracks down at your feet there?" My grandfather said, "Yeah." He said, "Those are rabbit tracks, and at the end of them is your breakfast. Now go." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "What could I do? The fellow was worthless." He said, "I took the gun, I put it on my shoulder, I took the shells, I put them in my pocket, I set off into the woods following the rabbit tracks." I said, "Well, what happened then?" He said, "I hadn't gone into those woods 100 yards when I come to the side of a large oak tree, massive oak tree. And sitting on the bottom branch of that oak tree were 5 wild turkeys." I said, "Turkeys?" "Yeah. And they was napping. You ever see a turkey napping? Strangest thing. What they do is they take their head, they turn it right around, 180 degrees. They fluff up the feathers on their back into a nice pillow. They set their head right down in it, go right off to sleep. And these 5 turkeys are stretched right along that branch, and they's napping." And I said, "Well, what did you do?" He said, I knew that they were sleeping, so I didn't want to wake them up. I reached into my pocket, took out the first shell, and as quietly as I could, I loaded it into that gun. And before they could wake up, I fired right into that branch." I said, "What happened?" He said, "John, you would have been proud of me. That bullet went right up through the branch. It split it right down the middle, just like an axe. And them 5 turkeys all woke up at the same time. They started falling down in between. Before they could fall all the way, the branch snapped back to again, held every one of them right by the ankles." I said, "Ankle? I didn't even know turkeys had ankles." He said, "Well, don't bother me with the minor details. Whatever it is at the bottom of their legs, that's what it held them by." And I said, "Well, what did you do then?" He said, "Well, I walked over and I snapped that branch right off the tree, threw it over my shoulder, because now the turkeys are hanging upside down like this, and aren't they ugly? I mean, they're squawking back and forth. I put the gun on the other shoulder, set off into the woods following the rabbit tracks." I said, "Well, what happened then?" He said, "I hadn't gone another 100 yards. When I come to the side of a hill, and I stopped to rest, and I put down my turkeys, I put down my gun, and I'm standing there resting, when all of a sudden I heard this growling sound. I look up, and there's a 300-pound black bear charging right down the hill at me." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "Well, before I could do anything, I heard this roaring sound. I looked up, and there was a mountain lion charging down the hill at me, and here I am between the 2 of them." I said, "What'd you do?" He said, "Well, the first thing I did is I said, 'Isn't this a nice mess?'" I said, "Yes, but what did you do?" He said, "Well, first thing I did, I realized that bear was so close to that I didn't have a chance to do it. I couldn't even pick up my gun, because you couldn't stop a bear with a .22 anyway. He said, so I couldn't think of anything else to do. When that bear ran up to me with his mouth wide open, his teeth glistening in the sun, I took my hand, I stuck my hand right in that bear's mouth. I said, you stuck your hand in the bear's mouth? What'd you do that for? He said, you know, John, I asked myself the same question. No sooner did I get my hand in there, I said, what'd you do that for? He said, but it startled that bear some. And if you don't believe me, you try it sometime. You go up to some bear, you stick your hand in his mouth, see if you don't get a startle right out of him. I said, no, that's all right. I'll take your word for it. He said, well, it startled him some, but the bear kept running. And as he kept running, my hand went through his mouth, down his throat, into his stomach, then into his intestines. I seen first upper, then lower, until before I knew it, my hand had popped right out the other end. Well, you want to believe that startled him some. But you know that bear kept running. I thought he was going to go up one arm, across my shoulder, and down the other. So what I did was, I reached up and I grabbed a hold of that bear's fluffy little tail. Ain't they fluffy, them little tails? I grabbed a hold of that bear's tail, and with all the strength I had, I gave that tail one heck of a yank. It's funny now, but it wasn't funny then. I gave that tail a yank, and you know, I pulled that bear inside out and backwards. You want to believe that startled him some? But that old bear kept running, and because now that he was inside out and backwards, he was running in the opposite direction. So I had time, I had all the time I needed to square off with the mountain lion, who all this time had been charging down the hill at me. I said, what'd you do about him? He said, well, the first thing I did, I decided I was going to keep my hands to myself this time. And that mountain lion and I, we squared off, all ready to do battle, when all of a sudden he said, we heard this barking sound. We look up and there's a pack of wolves closing in on the... I said, wolves? He said, John, must have been 12 or 15 wolves closing in on the two of us. I said, what'd you do about the wolves? He said, well, I don't mean to brag. I don't know where I got the strength, the time, or even the materials, but I built the prettiest little stockade fence all around us. I said, you built? Yeah, I was just driving in the last nail when that pack of wolves pounced on us, and inside a half an hour there ensued a battle the likes of which I'd never seen before or since. There was feather and fur and dust and gravel and leaves and limbs and lumber and turkeys flying in all directions. It was quite a sight. I said, what happened? He said, well, we managed to kill most of them wolves. Then that wasn't killed, limped off into the woods bleeding when all the dust had finally settled. I turned that mountain lion, he turned to me, we decided whatever differences we had before, they was now over. And he turned around on his heels and he walked up the hill. I turned on my heels and walked down the hill, following the rabbit tracks. I said, what happened then? He said, I hadn't gone another 100 yards when I come to the side of a stream. I stopped on the side of that stream, and I was wondering how I was going to get across there, because one thing my grandfather hated was being out in the woods with wet feet. L.L. Bean made a fortune on those people. He didn't want, he was trying to figure out how to get across the stream. He said, I looked across the stream, and they're staring at me dead in the eye with two of the meanest looking wild dogs I'd ever laid my eyes on. I said, wild dogs? He said, them dogs were standing on either side of a sharp piece of granite. It was almost like a knife axe. And I realized I was going to have to do away with both dogs, and I only had one shell. So I reached in, and I took the shell out, and I loaded into that gun, and I looked across there, and I figured that if I hit that sharp piece of granite right on the knife edge, I could probably split the shell in two and kill both dogs. I said, you figured you could do it? Yeah. It was going to be a trick shot, but he said, I thought I could do it. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, I aimed that gun at that sharp piece of granite and was all ready to fire when all of a sudden, he said, I heard a quacking sound. I look up and there was 12 wild ducks heading south. I wanted to take a shot at the ducks, but I had to put them out of my mind. I said, no, that's all right. Got to take the danger on first, so I aimed for the second time, was all ready to fire when all of a sudden I heard a honking sound. I look up and there was 12 wild geese heading north. Oh, John, he said, I want to take a pop at the geese, but I had to take the danger on first, so I aim now. Third time, my hands are shaking, palms are sweating. Don't you hate sweaty palms when you're trying to go hunting? He said, I aimed for the third time, aimed as carefully as I could, and I fired. I said, what happened? He said, well, John, you would have been proud of me. That bullet come out of that gun and went right across that stream and hit that sharp knife edge right on the edge there and split the bullet right down the middle, killed both dogs just like that. And I said, you did? He said, but the gun blew up in my face. I told you she was a rusted-out squirrel gun, blew up in my face. I said, well, that's too bad. He said, well, no, it isn't, John, because I found out later. The butt end of the gun flew south and knocked down all 12 ducks. Barrel end of the gun flew north, skew at all 12 geese. The force of the explosion knocked me unconscious into a stream behind me. By the time I come to in that stream, do you know that my left hand was on an otter's head, my right hand was on a beaver's tail? Got 2 nice fur pelts out of those 2. And when I stood up in that stream, my pants pockets were so full of beautiful brook trout that a button popped off my fly and killed a rabbit. I said, a button popped off your fly and killed a rabbit? He said, well, John, those pants were always a bit tight around the waist, and the weight of them fish were just enough to send that button flying, so that poor rabbit never even knew what hit him. Almost knocked the head right off his shoulders. And I said, well, what did you do then? He said, I gathered up everything I had, all the fish and game. I gathered up the otters and the beavers. I gathered up the ducks and geese, everything. I dragged it back to this fellow's dooryard, made a nice display right outside his door, knock on his door. He comes out, because now he's all dressed, had his breakfast, he's in good shape. He looks at one side, he walks his way over the other side, and back again, and he said, was this all you was able to get with the gun and the 2 shells I gave you? My grandfather said, well, I thought it was pretty good, tell you the truth. He said, well, wait a minute, see if I got this straight. I send you out in the woods with a gun and 2 shells. You're out there most of the morning, you come back. This is all you got to show, and you lost my gun? My grandfather said, well, I suppose you could put it that way, but yeah, that's what happened. He said, I can tell you right now, there will be no lesson number 2. My grandfather said, well, there wasn't much of a lesson number 1. He said, well, regardless, you will never make it as a Maine hunting guide. You might as well turn around on your heels and go back out to sea. And so you know what? He did. He never went hunting again. And when he got all done, we just sat there in his den for a good 2 minutes. We didn't say a word. Try that sometime. It's a long time, 2 minutes. And finally I got up the nerve, I said, Grandpa, is that story true? And he looked at me. He said, John, what part of that story are you having trouble with? He said, John, let me tell you about that story. He said, there were some parts of that story that I left out because I knew you wouldn't have believed them anyway. He said, but I can tell you of what I told you, every word of that story from beginning to end is as true as can be, and I have told it to you. Exactly as he told it to me, and I'll leave it up to you to decide. Thank you very much.